You know, during my lifetime, smallpox as an epidemic around the world was actually eradicated. And when I was young, everybody got inoculated against smallpox, and that's what began to put it out. Terrible disease, and we managed to stop it. The problem was, as my kids were growing up, I kept asking pediatricians, can we actually get smallpox vaccine still? I'd like to have my kids vaccinated against it. And they would look at you very strangely, and they would say, well, why would you want to do that? It's been eradicated. And my response was, no, it's not. It's in laboratories in the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Somehow, some way, somebody's going to let it out again. Welcome back to Steel on Steel. John Lefter here with you, Steve Schiller producing. We now have a new virus. It's a SARS-type virus called the coronavirus, which originated in China. Whence cometh this virus, and then what does that mean in terms of bioweapons programs that are going on in various countries around the world? Because there have been arguments in the press that the longtime practice in China of selling both rat and dog meat, as well as bat soup, enabled this transition of this coronavirus to these varied species, blah, 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 and going, yeah, that's a real stretch. What is really suspicious is the presence of a bioweapons laboratory in Wuhan, China, the very place where the virus emerged. Brendan Weichert's joining us right now. He's a geopolitical analyst who manages the Weichert Report. He contributes to the New English Review, American Spectator, and speaks frequently on national security policy and foreign affairs. You know, Brendan, I'm not as concerned about where this came from as much as I am why it came from there. Possibility of this coronavirus in its current form either A, being weaponized or just having accidentally gotten out from a laboratory right there in Wuhan, China.
Yeah, the article that I wrote for New English Review, I did a deep dive into the last, I think, 4 or 5 years of incidents of Chinese industrial espionage targeted against Western countries' biomedical research facilities, specifically in the United States and Canada. And what we found is there have been 55 open, active FBI counterintelligence cases into Chinese researchers coming over to the United States to receive federal grants from the National Institute of Health to conduct research on the coronavirus, SARS-like viruses, to conduct research on AIDS and cancer. And what they found is these 55 research institutions in the United States have been employing Chinese researchers who have come into the U.S. under false pretenses, one in which MD Anderson, which specializes in sensitive cancer research, one of these Chinese groups received $148 million in NIH funding, only to find out that funding was not going toward research in the United States. The Chinese were taking all of the intellectual property and sending it all back to their labs in China, and then creating whatever they needed to create, stealing from us. Similarly, with the coronavirus research, we've found that Steve Liebert, who was the head of, I believe it was Harvard's chemistry department, well, it turns out that he was secretly, as part of China's Thousand Talents program, which is where they reach out to foreign scientists and try to woo them to come over and give technology and information and trade secrets to China. Well, Liebert has recently been arrested and indicted by the FBI for secretly working to build a virology lab in Wuhan. Since 2012, he's been receiving $50,000 a month from the Thousand Talents program, and he's lied repeatedly to the FBI and to his employer at Harvard about the extent of his connections to that program. So basically what I've been looking at is how deep the Chinese biomedical industrial espionage is into our system. And it is deep and it is profound. And so when I hear the story about the coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan, the first thing I did was look up to see, well, is it related to the ongoing biotech threat coming from China? And of course, there you have the largest military-run virology center that specifically deals with the weaponization of the coronavirus in Wuhan. So what I think happened was that they were experimenting with some kind of weaponized form of this disease and probably had lax safety standards and probably let it loose either by accident or, God forbid, on purpose. And why they would be on purpose, I don't know. But it was probably emanating from this virology center in Wuhan.
Especially since it has, a 14-day incubation period?
Oh, it's rapid, and it varies. I just did an article for my website, the Weichert Report, where I've explored what's going on right now, where they're finding that in one case, within an hour of somebody infected with the coronavirus, They were brought into the hospital, and up to 11 patients and 4 medical workers were infected. I mean, that's insane. So that's not the normal pathology of a natural coronavirus. Now, the Western scientists are going to insist that we can't jump to conclusions, and the media is going to keep saying that, and they're going to keep trying to say anybody who thinks otherwise is a conspiracy theorist. But all the data points that I've seen indicate an extreme interest since 2015 on the part of China in coronavirus research. Now suddenly this is happening. It's all a little weird, and you look at the pathology and how rapidly it is progressing, and the fact that China has been trying so hard to cover it up, there's something more going on here.
What is the main method of transmission as we've identified it?
My understanding is it's a SARS-like disease, so it's inhaling, it's respiratory, it's throat, it's inhalation, close contact. In one case, I'm forgetting his name, but the Chinese doctor that died under suspicious circumstances in Wuhan after he alerted colleagues in December, and he did a video blog of the outbreak in Wuhan and was arrested and told that, he was spreading false information by Chinese authorities. This gentleman was telling his colleagues in the medical community, wear masks, protect your face because you're going to be exposed to the breathing in of the disease, and that's why he was initially arrested and interrogated for hours and made the sign of false confession. And many believe he died I think a month ago or a couple weeks ago. Many believe that he was actually killed by the Chinese state, though it's unconfirmed.
Yeah, I'm not as inclined to believe that, except now he's a hero.
Yes, and now his death is actually feeding into the dissident movement in Hong Kong that's growing throughout China. The hashtag freedom or death is now trending in China to the point that the Communist Party had to stomp out that hashtag, but it's still trending around the world, and that comes from this doctor's death because people no longer trust the government in China anymore to really do anything.
It's interesting because it actually parallels the Soviet government's reaction to and handling of Chernobyl, in which the hierarchy, as it went up the chain, they were all so busy covering the rear ends, the crisis just became worse and worse and worse.
Yeah, and I think just me personally, and I realize I'm an outlier with some of this in terms of my thought that I'm still not convinced it didn't come from this weaponized facility. The fact that China knew about this a lot earlier than December, the government was trying its best to tamp down, I think in part because they knew that if it got out, it would be revealed that this was some kind of artificially created or enhanced virus, and that's part of why they were so slow, and it's sort of this drip, drip, drip of information to the international community. It's been very stage managed by China, very strategically leaking. And we also know that my research indicated that China has been very intently trying to steal information on coronavirus, its outbreak pattern, and the vaccines that are being worked on in the West. And I was wondering if maybe the Chinese were trying to get information from the West in terms of exchange by saying, hey, we're going to give you all the information we have on this outbreak in exchange for you giving us stuff on vaccines that we couldn't get by stealing it from you. There's a lot to this story that frankly isn't being covered in the mainstream press.
Right. One thing you know is you can't guarantee transparency on the part of the Chinese government.
Absolutely. Any communist government. I'm doing a research article right now on Cuba and the atrocities there, and all the research says we don't even know how many people Castro's killed because they purposely weren't keeping records, and the Soviets did the same thing where they purposely weren't keeping records because they learned from the Nazis that if you meticulously keep records of your atrocities, eventually you'll be tried, if not in court, by history. So these regimes are purposely opaque.
Now, China has been, let's say, since the 70s, it opened up during the Nixon administration. China since then has been playing a catch-up game. It's been in an imitation game.
Yeah.
But it seems like it's in a transition now to become an equal partner. So they don't have the same rules that we do for safety and stuff, either in the space program or biological.
Exactly. That's the large thrust of the article is actually about China's leapfrog strategy. China has done in about 40 or 50 years what we have done in the course of 200 years in terms of industrialization and then transitioning to this post-industrial knowledge economy. They're doing that in half the time. And so they're doing that in large part by not having any rules, just pushing development, throwing mud at the wall, seeing what sticks. And if they lose some people along the way, oh, well, we've got $1 billion, we can take it. And so they are starting now, though, to see the downside of what happens if you rush development too much. You see this in terms of the pollution problem in China. I mean, even Beijing last year acknowledged that they're going to have to address the pollution issue. It's insane because that starts to have a deleterious impact on economic development over the long run. The issue of biotechnology development. They are experimenting with things in the biotech field in China that we could do here, but we, for ethical reasons and for security reasons, we don't do. Well, the Chinese don't care. They just want to see what they can do to beat us. All about beating the Americans and proving to the world that they are the great power and that no other power can surpass them. Now we're seeing, though, the downside. This outbreak, I think, is probably something related to going too far too fast.
Brennan Weichert's on deck with us right now. We're talking about the growing bioweapons threat coming from China. It's obvious that China has been, at least to this point, mismanaging much of what is called the coronavirus, always attempting to suppress it first. There are a number of lessons that come out of this, the first one being why things in socialist or really hardcore socialist Marxist societies go astray very fast. When everyone has to kowtow to a party line, we call it political correctness in the West, and when deviating from that has heavy penalties, even death in certain circumstances, that crushes innovation. That's why when there is a crisis, the very first response of the apparatchik, the entire mechanism, is to suppress anyone who sticks their head up and says, we have a problem, it needs to be fixed over here. Well, we can't say that. That says Marxism is bad. Communism doesn't work. The apparatchik is not in control. We can't have that. So rather than fix the problem, they will rather attack the people who are pointing out the problem with the system. And as Václav Havel pointed out, it is not a totalitarian system of individual worship. It is a systemic issue, that it's a system. And even though reality and the system begin to divide, everyone has to pay lip service to the lie, because anyone pointing out the truth becomes an existential threat to the system, and they can't have that no matter what the consequences. You saw that in the massive cover-up in Russia about what went on after Chernobyl, as the situation just got worse and worse and worse, rather than dealing with the situation. We actually saw that in Katrina, when it really did a number on New Orleans, as all the bureaucrats that were there in the state are shucking and jiving and trying to deal with this. And a bureaucrat always makes a decision on the basis of what's good for the bureaucracy, not what's good as people. And you have to remember that about real bureaucrats. They always think of the bureaucracy, not about the people that they're supposed to be serving. And it wasn't until other leaders came in and said, all right, enough of this. Stop. Go do that. Do this. I mean, General Henry was one of the ones that came in, National Guard, and took care of the situation. Okay, we'll be back with Brennan Weichert. We're at SteelOnSteel.com. I'm John Lufter. The program is Steel on Steel. Talking about the bioweapons threat around the world, there are problems with biowarfare, which you know is going on in X number of countries around the world. Welcome back to Steel on Steel. John Lufter here with you. There has been sophisticated investigation going on. I remember one time we caught the ire of some biology teacher or professor because we were reporting on new efforts to create viral infections which would target human subgroups, in other words, by racial characteristics or other characteristics, which up until that point had not been possible. I get this scorching email from this guy. This is crazy. This can't be done, blah, blah, blah. I'm a biologist. I know this, yada, yada, yada. Well, here's the deal. It turned out later on that there really was research going on in South Africa, and also the Israelis, I think, were doing it. And we don't know what's going on in the other laboratories out there. Remember, when we have our characteristics like the shape of your nose, the color of your skin, the color of your eyes and hair, that rides on the human genome. And if you can find the sequences that control the expression, where those genes are expressed, then you can also theoretically design a virus which would look for those expressions and then go after that particular group. So the point was he was behind the power curve. So why keep these viruses anyway? Because the gene sequence in there may be important to solving other problems in the future. So, at least for good purposes, they would keep gene sequences. There was an article back in 1998. Big News 9 had reported that the flu from 1918 was recovered from a frozen body in Alaska, that they knew the victim had died from this pandemic, and they were able to recover it. It was a terrible pandemic. Ironically, it tended to kill people who were younger in their teens, 20s, and 30s, but older people survived for reasons that I haven't yet found out on the whole thing. I mean, there were reports of soldiers. They feel like they're coming down with a cold in the morning and they're dead by 5 p.m. This is how bad this whole virus was. So anytime that there's a virus in a laboratory, there is always the potential it's going to get out by mistake or some malevolent power is going to allow it out. You know, there are some pretty rough stories that are, I would say, fairly credible coming out of China about taking certain groups that have been put into prison, notably Falun Gong members who are politically incorrect. But you've got Christians in there, you've got Uyghur Muslims and others, forcibly transplanting their organs for medical tourists who can't get the organ transplant in their home country. That means they have a very different morality system than we do as well.
Well, and you have to also remember the regime there does not view individuals the same way that we in the West do. And it's not just a Communist Party thing in China. This is sort of a Confucian mentality. It's always been a more centralized, hierarchical civilization there. And then you go back 5,000 years, these patterns are ingrained. The Chinese look at all of the people in the hinterlands that aren't living in the metropolises, that aren't really yet enjoying the full fruits of the economic boom that China has endured over the last 30, 40 years. The Chinese government in Beijing is looking at those people not as potential economic units. They're looking at them as that's a lot of mouths to feed. We might not be able, because usually instability and rebellion occurs historically first in the Chinese hinterland, in the outer bands of China, and it works its way to the core. And the Chinese Communist Party is keenly aware of that dynastic cycle. They might not be looking at the coronavirus necessarily as that bad for them in terms of keeping population under control. They might look at it as culling the herd. It's mostly in the outer parts. It is starting to move to Shanghai. It's starting to affect some of the more economic zones, which is a problem, which is why I think they're coming to the West for help now. But in the beginning, I don't think they were necessarily even looking at this as it's that big of a problem, because it actually solves some political issues.
And besides, we can learn something about the virus by watching it start up here before we manage to get it under control.
That's true, yeah.
I hate to think cold-bloodedly, but you can see them doing this type of stuff.
But cold-bloodedly is exactly, I don't want to otherize them too much, but it is important to understand that the Chinese leadership in particular, their frames of reference, their interests, their ambitions are entirely distinct from you or I, from our government, or even from their own people. And it's showing the way that they've handled both the Hong Kong situation with the protests there and with the ongoing coronavirus. They don't really care about the interests of their people beyond keeping them placated. The old agreement was, after Mao died and Deng Xiaoping started to do limited capitalist, if you want to call it that, reforms to China, the agreement was, we'll give Chinese middle class 2 cars and a stable lifestyle and prosperity more than they had under Mao, but we, the Chinese Communist Party, get to keep our monopoly on power. So as long as you don't mess with that, we'll give you the physical sustenance you need. That agreement is breaking down, and it's not just coronavirus that's causing it. Pretty much since Xi took over, China has been slowing down economically. They have been transitioning from a manufacturing, production-type, old-world economy into a post-industrial, knowledge-based economy. It's a consumption model like ours. And so in that system, you don't need as many people. You need more specialization. So in that system, they have a lot of excess capacity, and that's why they're shipping all the Chinese workers into Africa, Latin America, throughout the third world, because they're trying to figure out ways to ameliorate any kind of political instability at home that might threaten the political hold on power that the CCP currently enjoys. And it's important to note that when my wife was doing her PhD in genetics at Yale, the Chinese state-owned enterprises would offer my wife and her colleagues, they would send these job offers. You don't even need to finish your PhD. Just come over and start up a biotech firm. We'll give you seed money. You live in Shanghai, and you do the research, and we'll provide the overhead, and we'll split the profits, and you'll be making high 6-7 figures immediately. Don't worry about college debt. That was a common route that many foreign companies, many Chinese companies, and Russian companies would try to take with a lot of the PhD genetics cohort at Yale. It was very telling that the Chinese government or the state-owned enterprises were targeting American students, and we saw this, as I mentioned, with Dr. Lieber of Harvard, who was not culturally Chinese. He took the money and built that virology center in Wuhan. They're targeting our intellectuals. They're targeting the next generation who could be the next great innovators. They're not just sending their people over here to study. They're also trying to woo our people over there in sort of a reverse brain drain.
Also, I remember the security situation at Los Alamos when the leaks, a lot of them having to do with the Chinese government, again, were uncovered. Yes. The officials there said, now everybody shut up. Don't talk about this.
Right.
They wouldn't allow the investigators to do it. And I go, well, we have two problems. One is we've got these leaks, and two, we won't close the door.
Right. We see this with the scientific community and as well as with the tech sector. You have this ideology that's very dominant in those sectors, which is this utopianism. Openness is always preferred. Free exchange of ideas leads to quicker and better innovation. It's more efficient, blah, blah, blah. And it's true. There is merit to that argument from that perspective, but there is another component that needs to be factored in, and that is the fact that we are not one world. We are a world of nation states with competing interests, vying for limited resources, and we're trying to beat each other, whether militarily or economically. It is a competitive environment. The idea that we are going to just open kimono for our scientific and economic innovations is ridiculous. And I point back to the study that I did on this NIH issue. The NIH invites Chinese scientists over to do highly sensitive U.S. taxpayer-funded research. The amount of security questions that they ask, because my wife worked at NIH as well, the kind of security background that they do is not that impressive, considering that many of these researchers from China were dealing with national security-related issues. The extent was, do you have any ties to Chinese state-owned enterprises? Well, of course they're going to say no. Do you have any financial ties to the labs back in China? If so, what are the extent? Well, then they would lie and say, no, we don't. And what they found is in the case of the $148 million NIH funding grant that was pilfered through MD Anderson into China, the Chinese researchers that were sent here were actual members of the PLA. They were actually from Chinese military labs that were coming in and lying on their security sheets, and nobody was checking at NIH. They were saying, look, we just want to get the research. They weren't thinking there's a security side to this. So the FBI came in and forced them to go back and review all of these cases, and that's when they found 55 massively delinquent security issues in which Chinese researchers were just outright stealing money and information from the highly sensitive American facility.
It's almost like we have a Cold War going again, isn't it?
I call it the quasi-war, but yes, you're right. It is a new confrontation.
It is, and they're determined to become the new hegemon.
They are. I would just like to add, there's a lot of talk right now about the pending collapse of China, and I do think China has many internal contradictions that ultimately may be its undoing, but China is, 5,000-year-old country. They've had dozens of dynasties. They've seen countless regimes, and yet the patterns, the cultural and civilizational patterns and preferences pretty much remain the same throughout that time. And so while absolutely the Hong Kong issue, transitioning to a consumption-based economy, the slowdown economically over there, the trade war, this coronavirus, this may be the undoing of Xi Jinping. I don't know if it's going to be the undoing of the CCP, and if it is the undoing of the CCP, what comes after may be worse. I still think that whatever happens after the spate of crises abates, I don't know if it's going to end the quasi-war with China. It might just be another new round.
Well, it surely belies all the claims that democracy was coming to China.
Yeah, and you could even say capitalism never really came to China because what they have is state capitalism, which is really a form of fascism when you think of it.
That was like democracies coming to the Middle East with the Arab Spring, which rapidly became an Arab winter.
That's exactly right. And no two democracies look the same either. And so I wrote a piece at American Greatness titled, Is Xi Jinping Losing the Mandate of Heaven?, in which I posited that this could be the end of Xi Jinping's presidency, not necessarily the end of the CCP. And even if it was, if the best case scenario that a democracy that's vibrant and human rights respecting rises there, well, look at what they've done with a modicum of capitalism. You couple that with free markets with democracy, you now have a viable, truly long-term competitor in China to the United States. Now, granted, democracies rarely go to war with each other, but they do still compete. The European Union, for instance, for all of its problems, has been trying to work to weaken the U.S. dollar's hegemony for instance, in the international reserve currency for over a decade. And in 2001, the U.S. had 72% world reserve currency. It's now down to 61% today. And that's in large part because the euro has been competing fiercely over the last 15, 20 years. And those are fellow democracies over there that are trying to ping America. The same thing would happen with a democratic capitalist China. Again, I'm for that. I think democratic capitalist China is the best case solution here. But there are still some downside risks if you're an American nationalist like me.
See, I think when you talk about Xi Jinping, his biggest problem is if their equities and other issues that they have in their economic system, which is rather intimately tied to ours. If it goes hooey, Xi Jinping's worst enemy is going to be the Chinese middle class that's gotten used to its middle class life.
That's exactly right. And the problem is that Xi has, since 2012, torn apart the institutional framework that Deng Xiaoping established to protect the Chinese Communist Party. And he's aggregated as much power, and he's still doing it, as he can toward himself. Now, in the high times, that's good for him. That means that he's getting credit where it's probably not due for all kinds of good things that are happening in China. But when you hit a low point, that means he's taken on all the responsibilities. I'm already looking at it and hearing that cadres within the upper echelons of the CCP are quietly forming against Xi, anticipating his inevitable downfall. And so they're seeking to preserve the party's rule and probably to excommunicate Xi after his popularity and his power reaches its low point, which it looks like it is declining.
And the short-term focus, of course, is always containing this coronavirus in a way that it affects as few people as possible. Brandon Weichert, who is geopolitical analyst who manages the Weichert Report, and you're at weichertreport.com.
And I also have a book coming out, Winning Space, How America Remains a Superpower, by Republic Book Publishers this fall.
Back in a sec, we're at steelonsteel.com. I'm John Lufter. The program is Steel on Steel.